July Tynwald saw several debates about housing and development, with reassurances given about lots of work going on behind the scenes. An entertaining exchange saw the Housing Minister attempting to woo Jason Moorhouse, but he was playing hard to get. We'll hear some of the debate, as well as some interviews recorded at the July sitting, later in the programme. But first, Home Affairs Minister Jane Poole-Wilson MHK, who had a question from Onchan MHK Julie Edge about the cost of the new Sexual Assault Referral Centre.
The Minister back on the 3rd of March 2022 stated that we'd be getting secured £800,000 with an additional £314,000 put aside for wraparound services. Can the Minister explain what the significant increase is of £3.38 million? And the wraparound services back in 22 was £314, but DHA have only transferred £311 in 23, 24, 25. To Manx Care, there's something clearly wrong. Only in February 2024, the CEO of the department said it was going to be a best-in-class service and the construction expected to cost £830,000. That was in February 2024. Here we are in July being told that it's £3.38 million with all the additional costs. What did the department not know in February when they were in front of a Tynwald committee? What did they not know then that they know now?
So that was the premise of Julie Edge's question. Has the new Sexual Assault Referral Centre gone over budget? Home Affairs Minister Jane Poole-Wilson responds. You had a question in July, Tynwald, in relation to the Sexual Assault Referral Centre, and it's fair to say there appeared to be a little bit of a disagreement on the floor in relation to that.
Well, I welcome the question, actually, because I think the building of our new Sexual Assault Referral Centre is a really positive step forward. So I welcome the question because it was a good opportunity not only to remind honourable members in Tynwald, but also the wider public of the purpose of this new facility and the importance that it will, once it's built, provide appropriate spaces to provide not only forensic and clinical support for survivors of sexual violence, but also signposting to other support services as well as police-led interview rooms. So it's a very positive story. And it also allowed me, I think, as well, to remind people that the service already exists. So while the building of a new facility is underway, the clinician-led service to support survivors of sexual violence is very much underway and does see, sadly, has to see people who are victims on the Isle of Man. But I think the question that came up was actually what's the capital cost for the building of the Sexual Assault Referral Centre. So I referenced that the capital cost is £3.383 million. And the question was asked of me, well, that's wholly different to a figure that was given in evidence before a Tynwald committee in February 2024. Now, at the time, I couldn't check that, but I have subsequently checked that. And in fact, the capital sum of £3.383 million was approved for the first time by Tynwald in February 2023 as part of the 23-24 budget and appeared again in the Pink Book for 24-25 budget. So I have written to Tynwald members to clarify that because I think it's important that these things are clarified, and I did undertake that I would do that. But it's something very, very important so that the public, if anybody was listening in, does understand that the sum that I was quoting in July Tynwald had been approved back in February 2023.
Because Miss Edge, the figure she had was about a quarter of the figure you're quoting.
Yes, and, as is often the way when capital projects are coming forward, sometimes in earlier iterations of the budgeting process, you will see tranches of money coming through and adding into the total sum. But I wanted to be absolutely clear, not only with my colleagues in Tynwald, but, I think it's helpful to reiterate this in the public mind, that the current budgeted sum was approved by Tynwald in February 2023. And I suppose the other thing is it's one of those really difficult things, I think, for all of us in Tynwald, because we have a huge privilege, I guess, being able to speak in Parliament. But it's always helpful, and I suppose it's something all of us have to be mindful of, to try and always go back to the source, whether it's Pink Book budget or, we have Hansard, we also have the Listen Again facility to try and make sure that the source of our information is as accurate as possible.
Moving on then to COVID, of course, your department has quite a lot to do with emergency planning. And of course, we don't know what the next emergency is going to be. It may be another virus. It could be, it could be Ebola. It could be any amount of things. Could be a plane crash. Could be anything. How does the department responsible for emergency planning actually plan for what is effectively an unknown emergency?
So, yes, I think a significant part of the debate and the response to the Kate Brunner KC COVID review was her recommendations in relation to the future of emergency planning. And I think you've made a very good point, Phil, that there are a whole raft of ways in which emergencies might arise. And I suppose our emergency planning function works incredibly well at what you might call the sort of blue light related emergencies that are more, if you like, day to day. We might see those, but they will quite often tend to be the shorter types of emergencies. I think the wider concern is when we might see a prolonged emergency with it could have all sorts of potential ramifications for the Isle of Man. So I think that is why there were a number of recommendations about enhancing our emergency planning ability. And I'm pleased that there was really sort of positive engagement in the debate in July on this, that there was recognition, I think, from members in Tynwald that work has been underway actually to develop out our emergency planning function, but further work is needed. And actually in the response from government, we set out now over the next 2 years some transformation work to facilitate our ability to plan better and have plans, to exercise those plans, to think through in a variety of emergency situations that could arise for the island. So that work, transformation work almost, will go ahead now over the next 2 years, which I hope will put us on a much surer footing for the range, as you say, of potential emergencies that could arise.
And of course, it in the aftermath of COVID, it's relatively easy to see this as an important function of government. As we drift through, and let's hope that it's a decade or more before another big emergency hits the Isle of Man, it becomes less and less of a priority because it's not happened recently. How do you keep pushing the case for emergency planning when there are significant problems still in terms of health funding? There's problems in terms of education funding. We've got problems in terms of infrastructure funding and difficulties in getting the additional tax income that we need to pay for all this.
Well, I agree with you. It is probably one of those things that can end up falling off the radar or being deemed less important when compared with something that looks immediate and urgent today. But I suppose there's a couple of things really. One would be we do live, sadly, in a more increasingly volatile and uncertain world. So I think it was the Chief Minister in his contribution to the debate said, the next emergency could conceivably arise because of a war situation. So I think that backdrop, unfortunately, of wider world events is something that should keep us focused on our ability to ensure that our emergency planning transforms to the right place where we would like it to be. I think the other thing is that the COVID pandemic and its far-reaching tentacles and impact on so many people, I think will stay in our memories for some time. And the impact is still clearly felt by people in so many ways. And we did spend some time, I think, in July Tynwald trying to take ourselves back, actually, to the beginning, where so much was unknown and there was huge fear and huge uncertainty. And I think the very fact of that brings to the fore that we can't lose sight of this, that if a serious emergency were to happen, it matters hugely that we have positioned ourselves in order to address it, because the implications, whether it's around education, health, the economy, wider society, we know that they can be felt not only immediately but in the longer term, and therefore it behoves us to be in a position as much as we can so that we can try and manage and mitigate the impact of any future emergency, whatever its form.
Is there currently any legal requirement for government to have an emergency planning centre? And perhaps if there isn't, maybe that's something that could help ensure that this was certainly kept on government's books.
So, I mean, one of the things that is part of the recommendations from the Brunner review is that there should be reporting going forward on how we're getting on with our emergency planning function. So there are two ways that we will take that forward at the moment. One is the commitment of the government anyway to talk about how we're getting on with all of the COVID review recommendations through the Island Plan reporting mechanism. But when it comes to emergency planning, we will also pick that up in the Home Affairs Department plan reporting. I think as part of the transformation work over the next couple of years, I think thinking about how we go forward as well and make sure that we report and keep that emergency planning role and function front and centre and in a future government's mind, actually, that will be one of the things that comes out of this transformation work. And yes, there are some legal requirements. So it's the I think it's the Home Affairs Board Act, and I forget, it's from the 1980s. I forget the year exactly, but that is the statutory provision that requires the Department of Home Affairs to plan. But of course, that was written in a very different time, and the reality is emergency planning has to go fully across the public service. And so one of the actions that was taken in 2023 was to update a Council of Ministers direction on emergency planning, which requires all departments, statutory boards and offices to cooperate in developing emergency planning, but also testing and being able to deliver in an emergency. But we will build on that going forward.
And then finally, you had a few orders at the end of the Tynwald order paper. What were those about?
So the main one that I imagine will be of interest to people was in relation to the licensed hospitality sector. We did put in a new framework in 2022, updating the licensing framework in the Isle of Man. And then as part of the bedding in of that new framework, it became apparent from feedback, particularly from smaller businesses, but also some clubs and so on, it became apparent that the rules that were in place about what's known as general attendance, i.e. having the licensee or a responsible person on the premises when they're open, was starting to cause some challenges for some parts of the sector. So it's taken some time, but there has been a lot of engagement, public consultation as well, to try and amend those general attendance rules to provide a bit more flexibility and recognise the balance between enabling the licensed sector to flourish whilst maintaining high standards to protect the public overall. So one of the things I was bringing forward, well, two of the items were delivering the changes in general attendance to recognise the feedback and the positive engagement we've been able to have with the licensed sector.
And the final one was Money-Val, wasn't it?
It was, and I recognise that perhaps not everybody follows closely the requirements of Money-Val, but again, in terms of our overall economy and the good standing of the island, making sure that we are addressing all steps that we need to keep our legislation on the Isle of Man up to date in terms of anti-money laundering and countering of terrorism financing is a really important thing. So yes, one of the items was part of updating and bringing forward new rules in that area.
That was Jane Poole-Wilson. We'll be looking at housing and departmental memberships after the break. You're listening to a perspective roundup of some July Tynwald highlights. A community infrastructure levy is basically a levy on developers to pay for infrastructure. Cabinet Office Minister Kate Lord-Brennan MHK was not prepared to talk to me about this, but this is what she said to July Tynwald.
In short, the impetus for this came from Tynwald Court in November 2020 when considering the area plan for the East. Tynwald then agreed to an amendment to the motion that required a proposal for a community infrastructure levy to be introduced by April 2021. Mr. President, Before any proposal could be formed to introduce a community infrastructure levy, detailed evidence about the viability of development needed to be obtained. Viability assessment looks at whether the value generated by developing a site is more than the cost of developing it. This is why consideration of the introduction of any community infrastructure levy must be considered through a lens of development viability assessment. I'll try to outline these matters in the forward to the council response. If the balance is not there and is not correct, and any enforced levy cannot be absorbed, then any levy could act as a disincentive to development at all. And we're already clear, Mr. President, in government, and I think also in this Honourable Court, about the need to regenerate brownfield sites and of the need for more housing to meet needs. So you would want any proposed community infrastructure levy to add, not take away, or stymie the development of the things that are needed. The evidence in a study that would be needed to inform what rate any levy should be set at and what, if any, types of development should be exempt or have partial relief from a levy. So, whilst the basis and idea for a community infrastructure levy is sound, I believe, and is appealing, it is detailed work and it should act as an achievable contribution, not something which stymies development which is needed and acceptable in terms of policy and established development planning. The decision based on the studies and the needs to get things moving on the island is not to put this in place now, but to absolutely revisit this proposal. The evidence shows us that to do so now would act as a deterrent to the development of much needed housing. The Objective Assessment of Housing Needs report debated in here last month also set out the need for significant development for housing for people. There remains other tools such as Section 13 agreements and conditions on planning applications that can be utilised to deliver the ever-needed planning balance and contribution. We will keep the situation under review in the planning policy team in Cabinet Office. The issue will also be scheduled for review conclusion again in 2027, so within the next couple of years.
Chris Thomas was once again active in Tynwald. I spoke to him about a couple of items. The first one was in relation to community infrastructure levy, and I think you or one of your colleagues in the what are the policy alliance, isn't it?
It was me, yeah.
Yeah, had asked for reports in relation to development to be brought forward, and these reports basically were recommending that the community investment infrastructure levy now was not the time, even though it's still a good idea, now is not the time to introduce it.
So the development viability analysis, the independent analysis, is published, and I congratulated the Minister for having done that. I couldn't help remarking that it would have been even better if it had been last year or the year before at that, because it has been completed for some time. I then said now the policy debate on the island infrastructure scheme, on the work of the Manx Development Corporation, and also about how planning decisions are presented to the public commences. And the example I gave of that was this site above the rugby ground, this side of Union Mills, which has been suggested has a nursery, a community facility and a primary school alongside it. And I asked, does that mean the developer is paying for all these things? And then I went back into the sort of evolution of this policy around this area. I mentioned Mr. Cragine, because Mr. Cragine was passionate about community infrastructure levy and getting people to contribute to the grey infrastructure and the green infrastructure around development sites, building, I think, Mr. Cragine's case on earlier contributors as well. That might have even been yours truly, yourself, and it was all written up in the National Infrastructure Strategy, which is an excellent document from 2016-2017. And again, it was written up in the housing policy at the end of the last administration. So we are where we are now. We've had development viability assessed. We've got a methodology that can be applied. And the policy debates now start on luxury flats in Port Erin versus direct investment in housing on brownfield sites and all the other issues.
And for those who aren't in the know, a community infrastructure levy What was that exactly?
Okay, so the Community Infrastructure Levy is under a part of the Town and Country Planning Act. We go beyond the normal obligations for affordable houses and open spaces to take money off of developers to help us contribute to roads or schools or more green or active travel facilities or whatever around the facility. And
but in essence, when you say you take the money off the developer, what happens is the developer puts the money that they're going to end up having to pay onto the cost of the house, so the house becomes more expensive. So ultimately, it's house buyers that are paying this.
Yeah, if it's housing, but it could also be applied to other sorts of development. You're quite right, and what the independent consultants concluded is, from the evidence they'd received from developers and government, it seemed like it was premature to be putting more costs on developers at this stage. So we've got a vague conclusion from government, which is we won't review it again till after the general election in 2027, although we could review it beforehand if it became appropriate to review it beforehand. So essentially that discussion of community infrastructure levy, sharing proportionately costs of things like sewerage works around Peel and the like, that's all been put on hold in a way until further consideration down the road.
And finally then, the Infrastructure Minister was quite robust in the debate which was surrounding the fixed-term tenancies. Quite robust in his reply. An awful lot of work is going on behind the scenes, and yet members felt that 3 years into this administration they needed to see more than just an awful lot of work happening. Minister's response was, well, actually, if some of you people who sit outside of government would actually come and take part and help, we might be able to get more done.
No, well, I think Mr. Moorhouse's response to that was persuasive. Basically, he said that a lot of the changes that have come from private motions from Mr. Moorhouse himself, from Mr. Ashford, a backbencher, and from myself, because perhaps all this started back in June 2020 when I moved the first all-island national housing strategy, law, integration, motion from which government's been responding ever since. So, I don't think as much progress has been made in the last 12 months as could have been made. I also don't think as much progress was made in the first year and a half of this government as could have been made. Essentially, government here, in respect of housing, has been the exact opposite to the government that's being having its Black Rob moment and its King's Speech across. Essentially, it hadn't made up its mind what it wanted to do with housing. It doesn't know whether it wants to increase the role of the public sector.
And does it know yet what it wants to do, do you think?
Well, it doesn't, because if you've heard one thing from the election across, it's costed and funded policy, and we don't have that in housing. In the cost of living crisis, Department of Infrastructure, when I was there, went to the cost of living response team and said £2 million would be well spent on helping people save money inside their own public sector homes by having a coordinated programme. We've got the plans ready to go, and we were told, no, you can't have it. It's got to be this winter. It can't be an organised programme. I've always wanted to have a proper housing scheme like we had before 2013 for helping make use of derelict, vacant, empty, abandoned properties. We still haven't got any money for that. I alleged in the debate today that one local authority, one housing authority, had threatened defaulting on its loans unless Treasury was more accommodating in terms of its comments. I'm going to keep that as an allegation. I believe it to be true. But essentially, I then went on to allege that the experts in Douglas City Council, Castle Town Commissioners, Ramsey Town Commissioners, Onken District, Peel Town Commissioners, the Ports, Braddon, who know about housing and do a good job, have been less involved in the last 12 months than they should have been. So basically, no. Council Ministers is probably divided on what we should do next. Tynwald is divided on what we should do next, and unfortunately, that's not a good way to deal with the problems we have in housing.
How do you fix this problem? Because this is not just about housing, is it? This is about the whole way in which Isle of Man government operates. In essence, ever since the ministerial system has been introduced, and probably before that in the old board system, but I'm not familiar with that, so I can't really speak with much authority on that. But effectively, we have an election every 5 years, and members of the government are elected. The government carries on pretty much unscathed and unchanged, with a few exceptional ministers making a few changes along the way. But in essence, because of the system that we have, you can't have people standing for election with fully costed election programmes or programmes for government to follow, because quite frankly each individual candidate doesn't have the resource to do that.
No, that's true. So you've got to work together, and you've got to get the civil service to take policy initiatives that are there seriously, so they help with costing and giving options for funding them. So I'll give you one example. Mrs. Christian's motion this afternoon is hugely important. I think it'll be a defining motion for the next 2 years. So basically, what Ms. Christian is arguing is that by October, Treasury should come back with costings for its island plan, its economic strategy, and the other commitments that government has currently taken on from Tynwald or from its own members of the ministers. And it also should explain how they're going to be funded. And I doubt, and that's supposed to come back from Treasury by October, I doubt Treasury is going to support that, because obviously that's saying Treasury has not been doing it properly for the last couple of years. So I think we're going to have a crucial debate on that. You're either going to say the current system's working if you vote with government, probably, who will try to vote down Mrs. Christian's amendment or motion, or you won't. So I think people are putting themselves into everything's working camp or it's not working camp. So then to go on further, if I go back to when I first came into Tynwald in 2013, 14, 15, I do think people like John Shimon had a really good go to get the real issues for the Isle of Man laid out on the table. And actually, I think we all went to the Villa Marina and we had working groups, and collectively, when I arrived as a minister after the 2016 election, we had alternatives and options that we could latch into. I don't think that happened after this last election, and I do think probably the 2016 approach was building on the experience from 2011, probably going all the way back to Sir Miles Walker's days. And I think we've lost something, and we've got to get back to that something, and that's why the Policy Alliances this summer is going to work on some short documents to summarise some key arguments, so that we can get civil service to cost alternatives before the next election.
Douglas Central MHK Chris Thomas. I didn't manage to catch up with Infrastructure Minister Tim Crookall, but he was in sparkling form in Tynwald, winding up a housing debate. Here's part of what he had to say.
Yeah, there are so many. I get all the emails because they all write to the minister, but actually, when I go back to the officers, it's like it's not right. They're being sold a pup just because something's not right. They're not happy with whatever it is. Please go to the officers, talk to the officers. In fact, I would say, and I will name Mr. Moorhouse because we had a quick conversation the other day. You were in the department for 4 years. This goes back longer than that. What did you do in that time? What did you do to help sort this problem out? And I asked you the other day, and I've asked you, I'll let you interject if you want to in a minute. Just let me finish.
Honourable Member, would you address the
comments through the Chair? Mr. President, 3 or 4 times I have asked you to come and join the department because you have experience in department, and you just go no. You could help us sort this out, Mr. Moorhouse. Come and join us. Anyway, sorry, Mr. President.
Oh, it's like a marriage offer.
I still extend that.
Say yes.
I still extend that opportunity for you to come and join us in the department. I still do.
Hear, hear.
I'm not going down on one metre, no. So, Mr. President, I'll start and go through these, but as I say, if I miss anything, and I probably will do, we will go back through Hansard and get them all. But Mr. Callister, I say thank you. He did come down and spent an hour with the officers, and one of those was our new director. And he actually, having withdrawn his motion last time, I thank him for that. And he came down, and it was actually when he left, he'd had everything explained to him, and while he wasn't particularly happy, he understood a lot more of what was going on and the work that's going on behind the scenes. And things are changing, as the report says. Things will change and get better. It's just taking time, and they can't do everything at once. And I know people have said it's 8 months over date and all sorts of things. If you haven't got the full staff, or the staff are changing, the staff have to learn the new jobs and all sorts. An honourable member sitting here shaking her head.
Excuses.
Saying it's excuses, and the comment she made before was along the lines, excuse me, Mr. President.
I do a point of order, Mr. President.
Wrong facts going out into the. I'm not the one putting the wrong
You're
facts
not giving
out.
way. Honourable Member,
Yes,
are you asking
yes,
to give way?
Yes, Mr. President.
Can I just say that I'm finding the aggressive nature of the Minister quite appalling in here this morning to backbenchers. Thank you, Mr. President.
It's not, Mr. President, it's not aggression, it's frustration on behalf of the department. We are trying our best to do the job, and I brought the report down. We put the officers in, upstairs to do a briefing. Some members made it, some didn't. Some said they were coming but didn't bother to turn up. Officers are always available to talk to people, and yet they just write in emails instead, and they just take what is being said to them at face value. Please, as I said, please talk to the officers because they know what's going on. I'm happy to pass you on to the officers.
Way, please.
Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to raise 2 points. The first one is with regard to the tenant. They had got to the maximum level of income, and I simply asked officers to look at that, which is an appropriate thing to do. With regard to my time in DI, I did a lot of things. You don't want me to go through all that in detail now. But one of the key things was in terms of housing, but that wasn't my area. I was in terms of bus finding and things. But what is really important for this morning, and I really hope the Minister considers, is that we're not adversarial. And when I was in DI, my frustration was that it was really difficult to get things done. And being outside a department, I'm freer, I can bring motions, I can create nudges, I can bring alternatives. Whereas when I was in a department, I was absolutely anchored down, and I was told frequently that I couldn't get any priority because I was a departmental member, and if any priority was given to me, it would look incredibly wrong for all the members, which was true. So I'm trying to be as constructive as I can, but thank you very much for giving way. Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the honourable member for being so constructive, and I look forward to further conversations with him going forward, and maybe he'll just consider that option still to come and join us.
So we've heard Mr. Krugell's offer. How did Aubrey, Castletown and Maloo MHK Jason Moorhouse respond? You had some fairly striking comments to make about what you perceive as inaction by government in relation to housing.
Yeah, it's quite significant that we're now 60% of the way through the Parliament, and if you reflect back on why people chose us, housing was top of the list. There was no reference to the Bishop's vote, there was no reference to assisted dying, a little bit about green issues, nothing about wind turbines, and yet when you actually reflect on where we are and what we've done, housing has been such a minor consideration. And we've got things like today where we're actually looking at the thresholds. I brought a motion 18 months ago saying these haven't moved for 4 years. We need to do something. We got a shift then, so we've only had one shift in 5 years. And they went an updated document today which really doesn't take us any further forward, and you're thinking, what is actually going on here?
The Minister was very robust in defending his position and basically said there's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes and you should understand that and not criticise. And indeed, you were a member of the department for 4 years, and what did you do about it?
That's it, and reflecting back in terms of the last change prior to the one following my motion was in 2019 when I was in the department. But it was frustrating when it became very personalised, and at the same time, there's that frustration that the people wanting to get onto the housing waiting list have got major concerns that the actual thresholds aren't actually reflective of income levels. If you're a couple earning the minimum wage, working full-time, you won't get access to it. At the other end, if you're two brand new police recruits, you're not actually going to be able to hold on to that house because you're going to be earning too much. So we've actually got a really strange system where we're supposed to be supporting, helping people with housing, but at the same time the people who really need it are actually not getting access to it, and if they get access to it, their long-term access is going to be questionable. So it was a difficult one, and I did say it was more of an administrative task we're doing this morning rather than actually look at the problems and finding solutions.
And certainly you also mentioned the fact that the Chief Minister and the Treasury Minister were attending the opening of Parliament, and how exciting it is to see fresh eyes, a fresh government taking, at least making bold claims and making statements about policies and laws that they intend to introduce. Isn't that the way at the start of a government, and inevitably they get bogged down as they go through?
Well, I was surprised by the way in which the Minister responded in terms of how it had been ground down. I did refer to some of the things in my speech, but it is so refreshing to see what is happening on the adjacent island, and you're thinking, wow, why aren't we like that? You know, we're only 3 years into this Parliament, and what have we done? That first 100 days is so important. And I'm really hoping that the Treasury Minister and the Chief Minister come back and think, if they can do that, we can do 10 times better in the next 2 years. We can do really impressive things and bring real changes in that will benefit lots of local people. So I'm hoping that light switch moment could potentially happen on their return flight to the island this evening.
What do you think is the problem? I mean, surely to goodness it's not that hard to make decisions and move things forward. Why do you think it takes, or apparently anyway, it seems to take so long to get anything done?
It was the frustration I had in infrastructure when I was a member, and the current ministers asked me several times in the chamber and the House to actually go back. But the issue is, once you're in a department, it is so restrictive. It is so slow. It's interesting when we actually had the meeting about what we discussed today last week. We actually said, how long will it take to come back with something better? And the answer was November 2025. And there was horror in the room, and even the minister said 2025. And it's that kind of realisation that at the moment in the Isle of Man, we've just kind of become so slow, so unoperational, that we're not moving forward at the rate we should be moving. And given the zest of energy that's hitting the adjacent town, you're thinking we need to be trying harder and doing more. And I think that kind of what's happening there today, what's happening here today, is a stark reminder of we're not what we should be, and we could be much better.
The Minister, though, does have a point, in as much as you have an opportunity to be one of those zest-filled decision makers, but you choose to sit outside of government.
Yeah, definitely. And there's not been one day when I've actually missed being in the department. When I was in the department, every single day was frustrating because I couldn't move things forward because it was seen as being influencing the operational side. If I pushed things forward for Castletown, Aubrey Malone, it was seen as being forcing a priority, which again was seen as unattractive. If I raised other concerns, it wasn't seen as the way we did things. And once you're outside of that restriction, you can bring motions, you can ask questions, you can have informal meetings with the minister and department members and officers, and you feel to actually move things forward. So I think the difference between a normal departmental member and a backbencher without any restrictions at all is quite dramatic at the moment.
Is it not possible, though, you just had some ministers who weren't willing to give you enough sort of say in relation to the areas that you had responsibility for? And maybe it's worth giving this minister a try, bearing in mind you've identified this is a really important issue, and if you were and I suppose you could negotiate with the minister. You could say, okay, I'll join your department, but only if you will give me decision-making powers.
It is a difficult one, given there are opportunities there. At the same time, there are massive opportunities for a backbencher. And as I ended my speech this morning by saying, what happens next? Do we actually wait for DOI to actually bring something forward? Or does a proactive backbencher come forward and say, we need to be looking at the options that are available for those tenants who actually got the maximum thresholds, but also for other younger people wanting to take on mortgages and needing additional support? And as I feel now, I can find new routes I can bring to Tynwald that will hopefully be accepted, and then DOI will consider over the shorter period and bring forward. Whereas if I go into DOI, I'm just going to be pushing at a closed door.
That was Jason Moorhouse, MHK. His Southern Keys colleague Tim Glover was concerned about another housing matter. You have questioned the Infrastructure Minister about the mid-rent scheme. It is also fair to say that the mid-rent scheme has been discussed by several members in Tynwald this week. Most members seem to think that it was a good scheme, but the Minister basically didn't think so.
No, and he accepted full responsibility himself. I am the department, he said, and I took the decision. It followed on quite neatly from a question from June Watterson, Mr Speaker, about the brownfield site in Port Eyre, and of course developers, wealthy developers, being given money there to build what appeared to now be no Section 13 housing, in other words, affordable housing. It's all going to be luxury apartments. So we seem to be saying, on the one hand, luxury apartments in Port Eyre, and yes, a scheme that's helping people get onto the property ladder who aren't wealthy individuals. In Colby, no.
And perhaps it would be helpful to understand what the purpose, because this was a 5-year pilot, the mid-rent scheme. What was the purpose behind it? How was it supposed to have worked?
It was basically government was helping by paying part of the rent of the house so that people could put money aside to be able to afford to put a deposit down on a house in the private market and get onto the property ladder. Now, it wasn't announced that they were ending the mid-rent scheme, and that's one of the questions and beefs I have about this. I only found out about it when I was rung up and emailed by constituents who live in one of the 5 properties in Colby that's part of this pilot scheme to say they've been given notice, and I went and saw them, spoke to them, saw the correspondence, and hence my interest in it, because the 2 that I'm talking about, they actually wanted to, when they got the letter initially, made inquiries as to whether they could actually buy the property that they're in. So they're doing it for all the right reasons why that mid-rent scheme was set up in the first place. But the department has said no, they can't buy the property, and they're going to have to find their own accommodation. They have too much to be able to go onto the social housing list, but they're right at that little gap where they haven't really got enough to be able to afford anything, certainly not to rent out in the private market, because those rateable values are so astronomical now for people. So there's a real gap emerging for people who are caught in between being able to afford to buy their own house, but they earn too much not to be able to go onto the social housing list, and that's a real concern.
Well, I'm hoping to interview the Minister, although he's being a little coy at the moment, but the sorts of questions that I will be putting to him are what evidence did the Minister have presented to him in relation to his decision to end the pilot scheme. One of the couple of obvious questions: how many tenants actually went on to buy their own properties as a result of being part of this scheme? Your tenants in the mid-rent properties, and how did the department, or did the department, perhaps was a better question, did the department do anything to encourage people to save? Did the department ask, annually, every couple of years, how much money have you managed to save? What sort of proactive actions, if any, were taken to ensure that the purpose of the scheme was being delivered?
And we haven't got answers to those, and those were questions that were put, or supplementary questions that were put to the Minister. I think he mentioned something like 5 off the top of my head that had gone on to buy other property out of high 40s, 50 odd from memory. I'd need to double check all that. With Hansard being so far behind, it's very difficult to keep on top of what's actually been said and hasn't been said. It was figures to those extent, but of course that does lead to the second question that you asked. What control did the department have over the scheme? How is it being monitored? How is it being administered? And we didn't really get any answers to that. And mid-rent's talked about in the new housing document that we've got. What sort of housing are we going to need going into the future? Mid-rent is quoted in there. It works in Scotland as an example. It's one of the offerings they have there to get people on to answer the question about affordable housing and to get people to own their own property, which of course it has to be a goal of any administration. It's also been talked about, I know, and former Minister Thomas mentioned this, that he had spoken to a lot of local authorities, and mid-rent was something that local authorities were very keen to explore. So there's a lot of questions still to be asked about this, and we do need to get some answers. He did talk about bringing other schemes, but like a lot of what we've heard at this July sitting, they're going to bring something forward, but there's no when.
Your colleague for Arbury, Castletown and Maloo commented on the spirit of enthusiasm and delivery across the water now with a new government. Do you think that the Isle of Man government in its current guise is capable of providing the leadership necessary to deliver on things, particularly in relation to housing, in which we are still getting told that achievements are another strategy or another policy has been produced, but we're a little bit light on the concrete delivery?
I'd agree with that, and we've had a couple of examples just at this sitting alone where we're getting a report now to follow a report. That's not a result, that's not an action, and I'm particularly keen that we do make progress in housing. There's a lot of what I can say weren't issues at the doorstep that are getting quite a lot of prominence within the first 3 years of this administration, whereas housing, yes, there's a lot of work gone on. Let's not dispute that in any essence whatsoever, but people want results, and that's what we need to see in the next 2 years, results with regard to housing and affordable housing in particular.
One of the pleas of the Minister, and this was specifically to your colleague, but perhaps this could have equally applied to yourself, was for help within the department. He was basically saying there's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes, but he feels that he's a bit light in terms of department members at the moment, could do with some more support. Do you think that Isle of Man government can afford the luxury of having several Tynwald members, Keys members, basically sitting on the back benches and not contributing directly to government?
That's a very good question. I've been in the Department of Infrastructure earlier on in this administration, as well as Cabinet Office. I'm currently chair of the Office of Fair Trading, which what a great little team that is. Invaluable work they've done to sort out the gas issues in particular. And there is the scrutiny role. That's the other side of being a parliamentarian and a Tynwald member. There is the scrutiny role, and certainly the work I enjoy above any really is the work on the Social Affairs and Policy Review Committee. So government has to be held to account. It does need people questioning where we're going, and that is a fundamental role of any House of Keys, I would suggest. Yes, but sooner or later we need people in positions in government who are going to take decisions, and it's very easy on the one hand to sit there on a scrutiny committee and say we need more decisions taken, but then if you're not prepared to take those decisions, be part of the decision-making process, is that not is there not a sort of a weakness in that argument? No, I don't think so at all. And we've been talking in this interview already about wanting decisions. So the departments are more than capable of bringing those to Tynwald to be signed off, yet we're not seeing that. That was Tim Glover, MHK. So what do you think? Can our elected members really achieve more by asking an occasional question or moving a Tynwald motion than they could by getting their sleeves rolled up at the decision-making cold face of a department? 3 years into this current House of Keys, is there anything that government has done that has helped solve the 2021 housing crisis?
And how can we reasonably plan for the island's next big emergency when so many parts of government struggle to deliver the basic services through their constrained budgets? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, I'm Phil Gorn. Gora Maius and Geisach Rum. Thanks for listening.